Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on application procedure for smoke flavorings primary products. This is the last webinar that we have organized in this year of our webinar series organized in support to applicants and other stakeholders in the understanding of the requirements of the transparency regulation, its processes and tools, but we will be meeting again next year. My name is Margherita Guidi. I'm the Communication Officer of the Applications Desk unit, and I will be moderating this webinar today. While we wait for the next slide, I take the opportunity to remind you that we are connected live, and therefore we depend on the IT tools and technology, so bear with us in case we have delays or technical issues. So together with me, there is a team of Efsa colleagues. We have three presenters, Karine Leroux, Head of the Applications Desk Unit, Anastasia Livagno, Scientific Officer of the Applications Desk Unit, and Simone Gabbi, Team Leader of the Transparency and Confidentiality team. Together with us, there are also some Q&A contributors, which are Stefano Capè, Sara De Berardis, Costanza Casiraghi, Goran Kumric, Remigio Marano, Carla Martino, Camilla Smeraldi, and Francesca Volpi. These colleagues will be helping us with the handling and management of the questions that we receive throughout the webinars from you, and that you will submit through the dedicated interface of this platform. Now, a bit on the webinar structure. The presenters will go through the various phases of the application procedure for smoke flavorings. You can submit your question via the Q&A feature on the top navigation menu of your interface, and the Q&A contributors will address your questions either in written, so throughout the webinar, or during a dedicated Q&A session, which is foreseen in the last part of this webinar today. What is the goal of our webinar? The aim is to explain the arrangements, the steps, and the tools of the application procedure for smoke flavorings primary products implemented by Efsa following the entry into that you encountered and that applicants are encountering in the recent months following the entry into application of the transparency regulation. However, what it is outside the scope of this webinar is any clarification about the aspects of the authorization process which have not been affected by the transparency regulation. A very short webinar guide to briefly explain you how the interface works. You are automatically connected on listen-only mode. In the presentation window, you will see the presentation and the speaker giving the presentation, as in this case for me. On the right-hand side, you have the Q&A box, which you can use to submit any questions related to the topic of this webinar throughout the event. This webinar is being recorded. This is a question that we often receive, whether the webinar will be placed somewhere on the Efsa website, and I confirm it is recorded, and the recording will be published together with a post announcement on the Efsa website a few days after this webinar today. The webinar is in English language, so therefore we would like to ask you to submit your questions in English only. Some questions will be answered in written, as I was mentioning earlier, and some others will be instead answered live by our speakers or Q&A contributors in the dedicated session at the end of the webinar. If some questions, however, would remain unanswered, you can resubmit them via the Ask a Question Connect.efsa portal, which is available on the link in this presentation and that we will share again later during the presentation. Together with the recording, the presentation of this webinar will also be available on the website a few days after the webinar, and you will have the opportunity to consult it when you want. And having said this, I will now give the floor to Karine Leroux, the Head of Applications Desk Unit, for the presentation. Over to you, Karine.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Margherita. I'm delighted to be here today and to go through this webinar to drive you through the process of a life cycle of an application dedicated to smoke flavouring. We will introduce you to the context of the new process, which is driven by the implementation of the transparency regulation as of 27 of March 21. 4 pillars of the transparency regulation that we will see implemented during the presentation today: the increased transparency, more reliable independent studies, better governance, and effective risk communication. So here, the procedure that we are going to present to you today applies for all the dossiers submitted on or after the 27th of March 21. We are highlighting to you here the novelty in the process. So you see in orange highlighted what is the new element that is in the process of an application for smoke flavouring compared to previous time. And you see that most of the activity are in the mandate and dossier intake. So here we have the pre-intake activities that has been incorporated, like the notification of study, the pre-submission advice. You have the validity check, which include an additional step of the check of the notification of study, the publication of the non-confidential dossier, the assessment of confidentiality, which is done now by Efsa systematically, and the public consultation, all new elements part of the dossier intake. In the preliminary activity of Efsa, nothing changed, and then in the risk assessment, you see one element in case of confidentiality submitted in the context of the request for information during the risk assessment. And in the phase of output publication, additional element like the supporting evidence that will be published, which are part of the transparency, which is one of the pillars of the transparency regulation. And we have, of course, the confidentiality that goes from the dossier intake until the output as a new element. So this is the process of an application, very high level. Now, on the next slide, we will see the tools. So what are the tools that have been developed to accompany this transformation? We have Connect Efsa, which is the dedicated space on Efsa, where you could access the specific measures put in place, like the notification of study, the pre-submission advice request will be done through Connect Efsa, ask a question, public access to documents, and the public consultation. Now, the submission of the dossier has been done, the development has been done in close collaboration with the European Commission, and the submission of your smoke flavouring is done in the e-submission food chain platform. This is the place where the applicant or its third-party consultant submit the dossier. It's where Efsa will request additional information and you will be able to follow up the cycle. Open Efsa is the public Open Efsa on Efsa website. This is the place accessible to everyone where you can monitor the number of questions open. It's a dissemination platform and you have also proactive disclosure of information. A highlight on the Portalino, it is not to be used for the standard submission of an application, which are done with the e-submission food chain. This is only to be used in exceptional case, in case of data set or document supported generic mandates. In the case of smoke flavouring, it could be used in the case of an inconclusive opinion, and as a follow-up of the inconclusive opinion, the place to submit will be Portalino. Very small cases, we will come back to this point later during the presentation, but all the submission of application, renewable application are done on e-submission food chain. Okay, we have seen the tool, we have seen the process, high level. Now we are going to see the first step, which is to register. So on the next slide, any applicant, business operator needs to register. Registration can be done by a business operator, can be done by a laboratory or testing facilities that is conducting some of the studies commissioned by a business operator, and it can be a third party nominated by the business operator. It's important to remind everyone needs to register on their own as an organization. So all access to pre-submission activities needs to be linked to an entity that is registered. So very important for all the actors to register on their own. Okay, this is the account. Where do you go? First step, where do you go to register as a business operator or one of the actors? You go on the portal. On Connect Efsa, you see these 3 green boxes. you have the box register for the portal. So a potential applicant can start the registration. The registration must be done as a company is representing, so it's a company organization registration, and then you can attach name of individual that are part of this company. Okay, this is how you will visualize it when you register. Just to highlight that the contact person of the account can be added up to 6 people, so it's a maximum of 6 contact person under an organization. The registration is done, and we have a step in Efsa. So once you register and submit your registration, Efsa will perform a security check, few days, and then after your account will be validated. If you have submitted a request and it's more than few days and you have not yet received feedback, you need to contact again Efsa, because we are since months now, we are in a routine mode of creating the accounts. It's a step that is systematically done. If you have not yet registered, if you have not yet created your account, create your account on any application, ongoing or future application you will submit. Okay, an attention point here, because it's the importance of how to link different organization register. So if an applicant or a business operator would like to assign the coordination or the submission to a third party, both entity needs to be registered. So the business operator is registered, the third party is registered. From that step, the business operator can assign the third party to his dossier. So remember that this is something that we have developed over in April to be able to adapt, so that the third party, like in this case, Martin, can send a notification to Efsa or notify a study on behalf of the business operator once the link has been created. Another adaptation that we have done with the first experience is that we made possible since the 30th of June that a same person has 3 different roles. So a person can register as a business operator, as a laboratory, or a third party. On the next slide, I think we are done for the registration. So once the step of registration is done, here we are repeating again how important it is to each actor to register on their own, and then after to link the actors, the third party, to the business operator. So this slide is reminding you how to process that step as a third party. We are moving now to the service of the pre-submission activities. And on the next slide, we will start with requests in the context of new applications. On the next slide, we have first step is to request a pre-application identification. So the pre-application ID is a component, is an element which is composed of 3 elements: the business operator, the intended area, smoke flavoring in your case, it can be a feed additive, a pesticide, and the subject of the application. What is exactly the item and the topic? This is characterizing the pre-application identification ID. We will see how an applicant or a business operator or consultant can request a general pre-submission advice. First, the organization is registered, then the pre-application ID is requested, created, and then you can request a general pre-submission advice. This is done through the Connect Efsa. You can request up to 2 general pre-submission advice. The requests go in our platform, in our database, and Efsa will provide the general pre-submission advice and will store the summary of the pre-submission advice. When the application will be validated, at that time, Efsa will publish the summary of the pre-submission advice together with the valid application. This is one element of the transparency regulation, to be transparent if a pre-submission advice was given and to have a summary of the discussion. Thank you. So how, in the case of a new application, how to notify studies? So the business operator who has a pre-application ID or a consultant or a third party can notify studies in accordance with Article 32B. These studies are notified. They are stored in our database. It's a database of study notification. It's confidential. It's only owned by Efsa. And when Efsa is, when the submission, sorry, when the dossier is submitted, Efsa check the dossier, perform the validation of the application, including the check of the notification of studies. And then at the moment of validation, again, Efsa will publish the study notification with the related studies once the confidentiality decision-making process is over. So this is the 3-step for the notification of study in the context of new application. On the next slide, we will address now the particularity of the renewals. So in this case, I think we are still in the general pre-submission advice. Perhaps we go to the next slide. And we are a dedicated one for renewal. So in that case, the applicant will get a pre-application ID for renewal, a little adaptation from pre-application ID new application and pre-application ID for renewal. The applicant can submit the list of intended studies together with the study design according to Article 32C1. Same, the database is populated. It's a confidential database for Efsa. On the basis of the list of intended study, Efsa will run a public consultation, will collect feedback from the public on this list of intended studies, and Efsa will hold a renewal pre-submission advice. And here it is one renewal pre-submission advice mandatory for each list of intended study that went for public consultation. This is feedback to the applicant, and then the applicant can notify the study according to 32B. So this is the process for the renewal. What was mentioned earlier, just to remind you, in the case of a pre-application ID for renewal, it's very similar to the pre-application ID for a new application. Just because it's a renewal, you might provide the former application ID. You might link with what was your former application ID as a new application. This is to facilitate the identification of the content. On the next slide, still on the renewal, an information here, a pragmatic information here. In the case an applicant submit the list of intended studies according to 32C, and we have seen previously the need to perform a public consultation, to wait for the pre-submission advice for renewal to be held, and only after to submit the studies. In case for legal deadline or for legal constraint, there's a need to submit at any time. We have here this sort of workaround that have been created, listed below in orange, that have been created to allow the submission, the notification of study. We will see in the next slide. Okay, so here in the next slide, we have an applicant that have a pre-application renewal ID created, submit the list of intended studies according to Article 32C, but then not possible to notify because the process is first we wait for the public consultation, the renewal pre-submission advice to after notify the study according to 32B. So the workaround that has been created just for few cases where a legal constraint is, the applicant or its third party has the possibility to notify the intended studies independently of the pre-application renewal. Once this list of intended studies are notified, they are in the system, they are submitted and allowed to process with the legal deadline. Once the pre-application, the renewal pre-submission advice will be held, the applicant will have the possibility, this study notified, to link them to the pre-application ID. So it's like two steps to allow as a workaround to process in line with the process. Thank you. So intended studies here, some highlight. Perhaps we go 2 slides before, because here we have some attention point. Yes, here, attention point on how to submit. So the application type smoke flavoring, just to list an attention point for the renewal. the studies to assign to the renewal exclusively related to the renewal. Here we have seen some mix sometime of other studies for other purpose of like a new use mixed with them. On renewal, only the renewal studies. On the next slide, also from experience, attention point on providing the application ID, the former one, the one of the new application, because if you are at the renewal, you had a previous submission, so make a link with it. It facilitates the work of Efsa. Attention point on the content that the applicant and the third party needs to complete the list of intended studies. On the right side, you have the list. It's mandatory element that Efsa will check and accept or not a list of intended studies. So you need to verify that all these elements are provided. This is mandatory from the transparency regulation. So the intended study for renewal needs to contain all these elements to be considered complete. An attention point because we have observed and sometimes not so consistent information. On the next slide, I will not go through them. This is just an explanation of what is mandatory, what is the meaning of the mandatory information. You can go to the next slide. And again, the next one. Okay, this is explanation. You can read, it's just the mandatory information. On the next slide, a highlight on the public consultation on renewal. So this famous list of intended studies have to go through a public consultation. This is, we launched the public consultation 10 days from the completion of the administrative check. The public consultation on step 2 is run for a period of 3 weeks. Then all the comments received are considered by Efsa, and the outcome are discussed in the renewal pre-submission advice. A summary is issued and will be published, we have seen earlier, at the moment of the publication of the dossier. Here, detail on the renewal pre-submission advice and timeline. We receive written requests for renewal pre-submission advice. Efsa might decide to organize a meeting depending on the complexity of the topic and the complexity and the number of studies in the request. Then step 2, Efsa provide the advice within 30 working days. And step 3, as we have seen, the summary is issued. If we go to the next slide, this is just a reminder that a non-committal nature of the advice that we are giving, being a renewal pre-submission advice or a general pre-submission advice. On the next slide, we have prepared or we have explained how to prepare all the dossier, and now I'm going to give the floor to my colleague Anastasia on how to submit now on the tool. Over to you, Anastasia.
Thank you, Karine. Good morning, everyone. I'm Anastasia Livaniu, and today I will give you an introduction to the e-submission system, and we will also have the time to go through it in practice and have a live demo. This system has been available and operational since January 2018 for the submission of novel foods applications. But now, in light of the transparency regulation changes and in order to facilitate compliance with notification of studies obligations, but also for confidentiality assessment and dissemination requirements, this first version was extended to version 1, and the e-submission food chain platform was born, also shortly called ESFC. This platform is meant to support all different regulated product applications, excluding pesticides, that are submitted in the iEuclid system. And in the right-hand side, you can see all the different food domains that are supported. It is meant to serve as the single point of entry for applicants to prepare, submit, but also follow up on your applications, but also by the European Commission and Member States users to receive these applications in the first place, but also perform certain risk management activities. To the right, you will see that smoke flavorings applications are also part of this e-submission system, including all the different types, like new applications for a new smoke flavoring, but also applications for modifications of existing authorizations, or even the renewals that we saw also earlier in detail. At the bottom of this slide that will be shared with you afterwards, you have the link to the platform itself, the link to some different tutorials that you can follow and learn how to use the system, but also the user guide. I will now start sharing my screen so that we can move to the demo. As soon as you click on this link that I showed you earlier, you will land on the EU login page. The EU login is the only prerequisite to access the platform. And in the user guide, you will find detailed instructions on how you can get one of those. It's just a simple registration of your email in the European Commission authentication system. So once you authenticate and you log in, you will land in the dashboard of the e-submission platform. Here, initially, of course, the dashboard will be empty if you don't have other applications. But here you will be able to track and follow applications that are either in draft, so you're still working on them, or applications that they are already submitted. All columns have filtering options, so you can filter by authorization type, by application number, or also by phase. To the left-hand side, you have access to some support material and information, a direct link to the user guide, the EFSA guidance, but also at the bottom here, you can access the email of the support team, the European Commission support team, that you can send an email to them and get support while filling in your application, or even after the submission if you're facing any technical difficulties. At the top right of the page, there is this button, Create New Application. And as soon as I go here, the system will guide me to select which is the type of application that I'm interested in submitting. So in our case, I will select, excuse me, I will select first food improvement agents. Then I will move to smoke flavorings. And then here I have to select one of the three available options specific for smoke flavoring. So I can have an application for a new smoke flavoring, an application for a renewal, or a modification of an already authorized one. So for the purpose of this webinar, I will select smoke flavoring. For some of these application types, the recipient of the application is the member state. So in this case, you would have to select also in which member state you wish to submit your application. As soon as I do this action and I press the button to proceed, the system generates a template, a so-called table of contents, if you wish, that is adapted to the needs, the specific needs of this area, according to the data requirements of as these are defined in the scientific guidance. Here it is important to note that for all three areas, different application types for smoke flavorings, the table of contents, this template is the same. These templates are split in three major sections: administrative data, public summary, and technical dossier. In the administrative data part, we ask you information on the applicant's details, so who is the applicant who is submitting this application. The person who is responsible for the dossier, of course, this is possible that it is a third party, someone that does not necessarily work directly for the applicant. Information on the manufacturer, the subject of the request, information on existing authorizations for the same smoke flavoring, and also the cover letter. I would now like to draw your attention to these symbols we have here, the asterisk and the question mark. The asterisk means that this section is mandatory, so you are required to give information in this section, otherwise you will not be able to proceed. And the question mark just gives you some more information on what is expected from you for this specific section. So you just click on it and a new window pops up just to give you some further guidance. In the public summary section, you're just required to upload a summary that is free from personal data and free from confidential data as well. And then moving on to the technical dossier, here you will notice that we have a different structure. We have sections that you can expand and collapse by clicking on the plus and minus button. You will notice that some sections have some more subsections, so you click until you reach the section you are looking for. And I would like to focus on the aspects that of the platform that will help you comply with the different transparency regulation requirements. And I will start from the very top of this page, the pre-application information section. As Karin mentioned earlier, if you have engaged with Efsa for pre-application activities like notification of studies or pre-submission advice, it is possible that you have received a pre-application ID. So if you have such an ID, you have to declare it here. And it is possible that you have more than one. If you don't have one, you just say no and you proceed. At the same time, if you have any studies that you have notified, but they are not provided in your application, in this section here, you can indicate the ID of this study as you received when notifying, and the justification on why this study was not provided in your application. Also here, it is possible that you can have more than one such cases, so you need to do the same for all of them. Then moving on in the uploading of documents, of the different documents that are pertinent for each one of the sections. To upload a document, you just click on the choose file icon here and you start uploading your files. From the moment you upload a file, the system will ask you to define the document type. Here you have a list of predefined different document types that you can check and select which is the one that is adequate in your case. So let's say here the file I just uploaded is a technical dossier text. Of course, here you can add further documents because now you're required to upload in each section all the applicable information along with technical dossier text, references and annexes for each section. They are all submitted together. So here I can go and continue uploading other files. So let's consider that this one, for example, is a literature reference. So in this case, I would select document type as publication. And then, of course, it is possible that I have performed my own studies, my own tests in the support of my application. And in this case, if I have a study, I would go here and I would select document type equal to study report. Here it is important to note that as soon as you select study report as document type, an additional set of information is required from your side. The first thing you have to do is to indicate, and in order to support you comply with the transparency regulation requirements, you need to indicate if you have received an Efsa study identification, so if you have notified the study. So if this is the case, here you can give the Efsa study ID, but if this study was not notified, you are required to give a justification on why this study was not notified. Again, specifically for studies, some additional information is required, like the study type, to select from a list of different study types, to give a title, or define the study completion date. Here it is important to note that for any document that falls under the definition of study, as this is defined in the practical arrangements, it is important that you select document type as study report, because this is the only way to support you and help you comply with your notification of studies obligations. And here you can also click on the document type help note to guide you further on how to read the definition of the study report. Then let's say now that I have added all the documents that I had to add in my application, but I want to also request confidentiality for some of them. To do that, I have to go on the right-hand side here at this three-dot menu and request confidentiality. As soon as I do that, the file initially that I have uploaded initially is flagged as confidential, but then I'm required to do two mandatory actions. The first one is to upload the non-confidential version of the file initially uploaded, and then to also build my confidentiality request. To do that, I click on this button, and each confidentiality request consists of the legal ground that I can select from a list of predefined possible grounds, then give my justification, indicate which is the part of the text for which I request confidentiality, and also indicate where exactly in the text this part is. It is possible to have more requests per document, and I have to do it the same way as I did the first one. When I finish with filling in everything in my dossier, I have filled in my administrative data section, I have uploaded all the different documents, I have defined document types, and I have given the study related information. I have defined also the confidentiality requests. I'm ready to submit. I go at the top right. Here I have the submit button. As soon as I click the submit button, the system runs some validation checks. So you're invited to go through all of them, because the system will not allow you to submit the application without ensuring that all these are addressed. And this is an attempt to ensure that you have prepared a document that is as complete as possible. So the system is basically checking for all the mandatory elements that they are there. Once you have done that, and now I will go to show you a dossier that is already submitted, you will be able to see, I will show you now how it appears after your submission. So I filter for a smoke flavouring dossier. So as soon as you submit, a new section appears to the left here. It's called Overview, and it is showing you the timeline and a whole overview of your application. So here you will be able to see all the different actions and activities that have been taken in relation to your application. From the moment you submit it, from the moment that your application is forwarded to Efsa, so you will see all these different actions, the question number that was assigned by Efsa, but also you will also receive here the requests for information. In this case, we see that this application is on hold at the moment because you have received a request for information. And here also you can perhaps request also for an extension of this deadline. In the same timeline, you will be able to see also when the opinion, for example, is adopted, and any other step that the risk managers also take throughout the whole life cycle of your application. And with this remark on the timeline, I would now like to go back to the presentation. So I would ask my colleague to put the presentation back. Just to give you some more details on what happens to the dossier from the moment it arrives to Efsa, on the validation part and portal updates. So please, next slide. So from the moment you submit your application, it goes either to a member state if this was a new application or a modification, and it goes to the European Commission if it was a renewal application. So from the moment they, either the member state or the European Commission, forward the application to Efsa, we register this application and we assign a question number. This question number, you receive it in the e-submission portal, and at the same time, the question number with some basic information becomes available in the OpenEFSA portal. In these images here, you can see a screenshot of how more or less this appears in the portal. So initially we see a question number, we see the subject of the request, and in the timeline we also see the date that this application was received by Efsa. Then Efsa will start performing the validity check. And this one will include also the notification of studies check if there were some studies notified. And this is possible that incurs some request for missing information. So we will come back to you. You will receive this request, as we saw earlier. You will see them in the e-submission portal, and you will also be able to reply them and also provide additional data through the same platform as well. When the cycle of requests is over and we think that your dossier is now ready for risk assessment, we declare the dossier as valid. From that moment onwards, Efsa has now the obligation to publish the non-confidential version of your valid dossier in the OpenEFSA portal, and this will appear in the same page that initially we saw only this very basic information. Now we will be able to see in the timeline the date that your dossier was declared valid, but also the link to the public version of your dossier. And from the moment the application is valid, the assessment of the different confidentiality requests submitted can start. And with this remark, I will give the floor to my colleague Simone, who will give you more details about how this confidentiality assessment is done. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Anastasia. Good morning, everyone. Yes, we've seen how the submission of an application is working in practice, and we will now move on to consider how a confidentiality request is to be prepared, argued, and indeed fundamentally assessed by Efsa according to the applicable legal framework, practical arrangements, and available IT solution, technical solution. We have heard already that the transparency regulation applies to applications that are submitted on or as of the 27th of March 2021, which implies that the applications that were submitted before this date are to be assessed also in terms of confidentiality decision-making in accordance with regard to the previously applicable legal framework. Fundamentally, in the previously applicable legal framework, Efsa was had more discretion for the applicable procedure and the standards to be applied. In the new legal framework defined by the transparency regulation, Efsa has to follow the practical arrangements concerning transparency and confidentiality, as well as to the Articles 39 to 39E of Regulation 178 of 2002, as amended by the Transparency Regulation, which is referred to by Article 15 of the Smoke Flavouring Regulation, as amended by the Transparency Regulation itself. In terms of transparency, proactive transparency and confidentiality decision-making, the Transparency Regulation brought about quite some relevant changes and innovations. It introduced the principle of proactive transparency for all information, data, or studies that are submitted by the applicant to support an application dossier. This implies the proactive disclosure by Efsa.
I think we are encountering some technical issues. I see Simone is frozen and we don't hear his voice. Let's give it a second to see whether he manages to be back. Okay, no, it doesn't seem to work. I think Simone has some internet connection issues. Let's see if he manages to reconnect. Meanwhile, since I see that we are receiving quite some questions in our Q&A box, some of them have been already replied by our colleagues, the Q&A contributors, while we have one in particular that I see Francesca was suggesting to reply live. So before going to the Q&A session, I would call already Francesca, if you are available, to come on stage with me, and maybe we can already discuss and provide an answer on this question while we see if Simone joins us again. Thank you. So I read the question for you, Francesca, and for everybody in the audience to know what we are discussing about. And the question goes like, we have prepared and submitted the list of intended studies according to the requirements of the relevant article of the transparency regulation, as well as the recommendation of the EFSA administrative guidance of smoke flavoring application. The list contains also studies that were started or commissioned before the 27th of March. For these studies, the notification obligation does not apply. Therefore, we do not plan to notify these studies after the pre-submission advice will be provided. Upon submission of the application, will we be asked to provide a justification why we did not notify such studies, even though they were in the list of intended studies? So a long question, but I think very clear. So thank you also for the submitter. I'll give it to you, Francesca, for a reply.
Thank you, Margherita, and thank you for the question. I think a first point of clarification is indeed studies that were commissioned or carried out before the 27 March 2021 are not subject to the notification obligation. So what will happen basically for those studies, once the application is submitted, basically this system will anyway ask for a justification automatically, but then it would be enough to just indicate that the study was submitted, before it was basically carried out or commissioned before 27 March 2021, and this will be enough. One additional point of clarification vis-à-vis of the list of intended studies. The studies that were commissioned or carried out before 27 March 2021 will basically are also out of the scope of these new provisions concerning the notification of the list of intended studies and the possibility to receive by EFSA renewal pre-submission advice on those studies. So as a result, I would say that although those studies were basically inserted in the list of intended studies, they will not be subject to the renewal pre-submission advice provided by EFSA under this legal basis. I think I replied to the questions. I hope it was clear. Now I give you back the floor, Margherita, to you.
Okay, many thanks, Francesca, for the thorough explanation. I think we have Simone back meanwhile, so thank you very much also for filling in this gap, Francesca, and thanks, Simone, for being back so quickly. I'll move it back to you again so that you can start over from where you left. Thank you.
Thank you, Margherita. Apologies for this technical glitch. So I was indeed saying the transparency regulation brought about some distinct changes for what concerns proactive disclosure requirements, which apply to all the data, information and studies submitted to support an application. And this with the exception of information that is claimed confidential by the applicant. So unless this is done, all the information that is part of an application dossier will be shared by EFSA on its Open EFSA portal at the moment of the validation or admissibility. The main principles of the transparency regulation in terms of proactive disclosure and confidentiality can be described as I was saying, proactive disclosure of the entire application dossier. That is not only of the fish, of the main fish or application, formally speaking, but really of everything which composes the application dossier. And the confidentiality is only an exception to the general principle of transparency, which means that the burden of proof for submitting a valid and compliant and successful confidentiality request lies exclusively with the applicant. This also means that EFSA will keep on hold the disclosure of the elements that have been claimed confidential pending the duration of the decision-making process, which for the first level of decision-making is equivalent to 10 calendar weeks. For what concerns smoke flavorings applications, the concept of who can submit an application or confidentiality request is pretty straightforward, and it coincides with the concept of applicant. That is, the person who's submitting the application dossier is also the person in charge for the submission of the confidentiality request. In terms of procedural requirements for the submission of a compliant and valid confidentiality request, please note that you may have to use either the e-submission portal called ESFC that you have already seen in operation, or for what concerns application dossiers, or the Portalino, which is a proprietary solution developed by EFSA for general mandates, and also to allow applicants to submit complementary additional data sets following inconclusive scientific opinions. The confidentiality request, as we have seen, must include verifiable justifications and, very importantly, a confidential and non-confidential version of the document claimed confidential, on which a confidentiality request is made. The confidentiality request may be modified only at the request of EFSA. For instance, when EFSA is asking a request for clarification, that is to clarify certain elements of the confidentiality request, and by the timeline indicated by EFSA. Failure to do so will oblige EFSA to stop to conclude on the basis of the information available, and most likely to reject the confidentiality request. You're also not supposed to be paying any fee or other financial contribution for the processing of this confidentiality request. A distinct and important feature of the new legal framework is that confidentiality requests may be successfully submitted only on a few items that are put on a close positive list set out in Article 39 of Regulation 178 of 2002, as amended by the Transparency Regulation. This is the provision which Article 15 of the Smoke Flavouring Regulation makes reference to, and it is particularly important to highlight that only if the element claimed confidential may be understood as belonging to the items on this list will then eventually be considered for a proper assessment of the merits of the confidentiality request. If instead the element claimed confidential cannot be considered as falling under one of these items, the confidentiality request will be simply rejected by EFSA on this basis. Also important to highlight that EFSA is asking applicants to contribute to the sanitization and identification of the personal name by filing and submitting confidentiality requests on personal data pursuant to the EU DPR, Data Protection Regulation, and we'll come back to this later in more detail. Indeed, there is EFSA is under a requirement to make proactively available a number of personal data, notably the name and address of the applicant, as well as the names of the authors of published and publicly available studies supporting the application. Also, names of participants to EFSA's meetings may not be kept confidential, which means that if you submit a confidentiality request on one of these elements, it will be rejected. Instead, you must submit a confidentiality request for all other personal data that are present in the application dossier and that you consider should not be disclosed to the general public. For instance, and in particular, due attention should be paid to the flagging of personal data, including names and addresses of natural persons involved in testing on vertebrate animals or in obtaining toxicological information. As in this case, Efsa is required not to disclose these elements at all. Once a confidentiality request is submitted via the e-submission portals that we mentioned, you have also to consider that the confidentiality request must include the identification of the elements claimed confidential with specific references and an indication to the lines, pages, and documents on which the confidentiality request is made. You're also supposed to indicate the legal basis, that is the grounds on which the confidentiality request is made, as well as, very importantly, to explain why the item should be kept confidential, and in particular to highlight whether the information is in the public domain or not, because if it's in the public domain, it may not successfully be claimed confidential. To confirm that the harm that in case of disclosure, the disclosure would cause an harm to a significant degree to the applicant, and in particular that the information has been acquired in a legitimate manner, that the information would cause an harm at least equivalent to 5% of the annual turnover or the annual earnings of the person submitting the application, the applicant, and that the information in question is not older than 5 years in the version submitted to the Efsa by 5 years from the date of submission to Efsa. Now, we have to consider that these two last criteria are in fact rebuttable presumptions. So, in case you're in a position not to, you're unable to confirm compliance with these two requirements, you're asked to provide an explanation as to why, in your opinion, the disclosure of the elements claimed confidential would anyway result in harm to a significant, in a potential harm to a significant degree in the particular case of your of the application process. You're also asked to confirm whether the information on which a confidentiality request is claimed falls under the definition of environmental information set out in the AROS regulation. And then it will be for Efsa to actually take a position on all the elements and grounds and justifications that you provide as part of the confidentiality request. We have seen how the building of a confidentiality request in ESFC works. And therefore, it is, again, particularly important that you provide a non-confidential version of the file, that is a public version, with all the elements claimed confidential blackened in an irreversible manner, as well as the confidential version of the file, which should be containing all the available information, but with the information claimed confidential clearly identified in a boxed or earmarked way, so as to facilitate in these the flagging of this information to EFSA staff, EFSA's experts, and ultimately ensure compliance with the confidentiality requirement that you're submitting. Also, the portalino is to be used in particular conditions we have seen, that is to submit additional data sets following an inconclusive opinion, for instance. And the portalino works in a similar manner, although it is to be used exclusively to submit data sets on which you submit a confidentiality request. That is, unless you have a confidentiality request, please do not use the portalino. However, also in this case, you're supposed and required to submit and upload a confidential and a non-confidential version of the documents on which a confidentiality request is made, as well as to provide grounds, justification, and an excerpt of the text claimed confidential. This slide shows again in more detail how the confidentiality request is built in the portalino, and also the way in which you can confirm compliance or not with the criteria that we just explained. So to summarize, just a few practical tips. Please submit a confidential version of the document highlighting information claimed confidential. Please submit one confidentiality request per document and per legal ground. Avoid as much as possible submitting duplications, duplicated entries. And do not submit a confidentiality request on publicly available information, because EFSA will double check whether the information is in the public domain or not, and therefore you will simply have wasted your time for nothing, because the confidentiality request will be rejected. Then also submit a duly reasoned justification for each confidentiality request, or again, your request will not be positively assessed. Now, let's assume that you submitted a valid confidentiality request using the appropriate technical platform. Now, the confidentiality request is in the workflow and in the IT workflow, and EFSA will assess the confidentiality request as you submitted. In case we receive this confidentiality request, we then go and look at the justification you provided. We check the public and the confidential version of the documents. We verify compliance with the applicable legal framework with EFSA's practical arrangements, and then we share a draft confidentiality decision back to you via ESFC if it's available, or Portalino if it's available, or by email in case these options are not available. And we ask you to submit your comments within 2 weeks from the notification of the draft decision. And in this time frame, you have also the possibility to withdraw the application dossier, though obviously this will also stop the scientific evaluation on the dossier itself. It will give you the possibility of resubmitting the application with the full set of information justification that you may have to provide since the first moment. Once the timeline for the submission of comments is expired, EFSA finalizes the draft decision, signs it off, shares it with the applicant via the application workflows in ESFC or Portalino, or by email if this is not available, and this notification of the signed decision then triggers the possibility for the submission of a confirmatory application. That is the possibility that the applicant has in case they are not satisfied with the first confidentiality decision, to challenge the first decision and ask for a review, an internal review of that decision. Even if this is not the case, or if in case the confirmatory application process confirms the initial decision, the EFSA is then moving on and implementing the decision on confidentiality by sanitizing, redacting the documents in accordance with the confidentiality decision itself. In any event, one click more, please. In any event, even if the one click less, in any event, even if EFSA has accepted the initial confidentiality request, it may have to review the initial positive outcome of the confidentiality decision making by triggering a review under Article 39C of the General Food Law, Regulation 178 of 2002, in case one of its outputs identifies foreseeable effects on human health, animal health, or the environment regarding items that have been granted confidential status. If this is all the case, then the entire decision-making process will have to start from the beginning again, and therefore the applicant will be in a position to contribute and to make their views heard in accordance with this process. This is everything I wanted to convey, and I now give the floor to Karin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Simone, and I'm back with you to continue the process of the workflow of an application. We will go now to the public consultation, and on the next slide, we will just highlight 2 types of public consultation: the renewal and the new application. On the next slide, Perhaps considering the time, I will go quickly. So what is the process for a public consultation of a renewal? Particularity, we have seen it's the submission of the list of intended study that will trigger this type of public consultation. Efsa in step 2 will perform an administrative check, and this will be done within 10 working days. On step 3, Efsa will launch the public consultation. The public consultation have a duration of 3 calendar weeks and aim to elaborate for the renewal pre-submission advice of a potential applicant. So to elaborate on the views on the list of intended study. What is happening once the public consultation is over? 2 steps. The first one is that the comments from the public consultation are immediately made available publicly right after the public consultation, step 4. And step 5, they are made available to Efsa for their consideration. The way the comments have been considered will be provided as an annex to the pre-submission advice summary, which is published once the application is valid. So 2 parallel actions here on the comments received and transparency in the way we are providing the information on how it's considered. This is in the case of a validated application, perhaps a bit quicker to go through this one. So an applicant might submit the application once the confidentiality assessment has been done. So step 2, we move to the public consultation, step 3. In the same parallel way, the consultation has a duration of 3 calendar weeks. This is standard. And once the consultation is over, 2 steps. The first one is all the comments received immediately made available. And the step 5 is that the outcome of the public consultation is considered as an annex to the scientific opinion. So once Efsa has finalized its risk assessment, as an annex to the opinion, the comments and the way the comments have been considered will be made transparently available. I will skip the next slide, which is where you can find, we already mentioned on Connect Efsa, this is the place. So I'll go to next slide. This is again how to reach the comment we mentioned. So I go to next slide. The presentation will be made available. You can go in the detail. On the next slide, we are moving now to the risk assessment. The next step after is the assessment of the content of the dossier that has been submitted. And here I will just highlight in orange what is new compared to the procedure as we have now. The only difference is if in the context of additional data request, the applicant has submitted confidential information, we will have a step of checking this information for confidentiality. This is the only step. The rest is going through like a normal process. So output which is drafted, which is endorsed by the scientific committee or the panel. On the publication also only one additional step compared to the standard for transparency at the level of publication of scientific output. The supporting evidence will be also made available. This is your highlight that we are giving to you about key documents to read that we have prepared and made available as Efsa on the website. You will see on the right-hand side the link to the scientific guidance document. So on your specific area of smoke flavouring, a dedicated scientific guidance that have been updated in 2021. Also an administrative guidance. So you have 2 guidances specific to your area. The other documents are applicable in any area, so we encourage you to use this material available. Thank you. On this, we have closed the process of the application process, and I'm giving you back, Margherita, the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karine, and thanks to all the speakers for the presentation and the smooth going through the slides, even though we encountered today a small IT, connection issue. We can start off with the Q&A session, even though I've seen that the few questions that we have received have been already answered in written in our chat box. Therefore, I mean, this is a good sign. It means that the presentations were very clear. So thank you again to the speakers, and perhaps also the information that we are providing via the other different networks and channels we have in EFSA, it's clear. However, since we do encounter some frequently asked questions on the smoke flavorings aspects and the usage of specific tools, we have selected a few common received questions, and for this I would call little by little some of the speakers and Q&A contributors to help me out in making a bit some highlights on recurrent issues we encounter. And the first one that I would like to join me on screen is Anastasia. On the suggestion, maybe you can formulate it yourself, Anastasia, since you have a good understanding of what we want to discuss. Over to you.
Thank you, Margherita. I'm just taking the opportunity here from one of the questions we have received to indicate for everyone that the e-submission system is a new system, of course, for everyone. So I think this is a very good opportunity to receive your feedback on how you find it and what you think that could be that we could do to improve it. So I would like to invite you to submit your suggestions for improvements, not only for smoke flavorings, but for all other types of applications that perhaps you are dealing with, to submit them at the support email that is provided through the ESFC platform. And we are in touch with the colleagues from the Commission, and everything that is proposed and is on the table for improvement, we are very happy to discuss and improve further. As I said, it's a new system, so we will learn from you and we will try to make it better. Back to you, Margherita.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. I will now call Stefano Capè if he can join me on screen. And this question is a question that we actually discussed also in other webinars for the other food sector area. I'll read it for you, Stefano, and then maybe you can make a bit of an explanation of what the appropriate answer is. So the question that we always receive is, do I always need to collect a pre-application ID before notifying studies, or can I submit studies without a pre-application ID? Over to you, Stefano, for an explanation on this.
Thank you, Margherita. Very interesting question. I have to stress out that the pre-application identification is a mandatory part of a study notification. So when you reach to the point that basically to submit the dossier application, we should always find attached to all the study notification a pre-application ID. So this is absolutely necessary to have valid study notifications in the dossier submitted. The practical arrangement foresee only one case where basically notification of study may not be attached with a pre-application ID. That is when basically you perform new studies during the risk assessment process requested by Efsa, and you didn't do any pre-application activities. So in this case, you didn't have any pre-application ID to, let's say, put this study. For this reason, it's allowed to have a study notification without pre-application ID. But in all the other cases, the pre-application ID should be provided, okay, and it should normally be taken before, let's say, the creation of the notification of study. So the step is you create the pre-application ID and then you add the studies to the pre-application ID. This is the normal process. I hope that that clarifies this doubt that sometimes we get from our internal questions. Thank you, Margherita.
Many thanks, Stefano. Very helpful. Another one that we usually receive on general pre-submission advice and renewal pre-submission advice, and for this one I will call Remigio Marano on stage with me, and I'll read it for you, Remigio. The question is, can I ask for general pre-submission advice for applications for renewal? Over to you for the answer.
Thank you for the question, Margherita, and good morning, everyone. And the answer is yes. So we invite applicants to ask for general pre-submission advice, also for applications for renewal. However, the scope of the general pre-submission advice is very different from the scope of the renewal pre-submission advice, as the general pre-submission advice covers only the rules and the content of an application. In the general pre-submission advice, you need to detail all your questions, being very precise in the questions, and then you will receive support from Efsa. I also remind you that you are entitled up to 2 pre-submission advice per pre-application ID. Thank you, Margherita. Back to you.
Many thanks to Remigio as well, and I have a last one for which I would like to call again on stage Francesca. And this one is a question that we often receive also for other food sector area, but also from the smoke flavorings applicants, and I read it for you, Francesca. The question is, how should I proceed with studies run by third country laboratories? Do I need to notify those? Over to you for the answer.
Thank you, Margherita. Can you hear me? I still have a message like I'm on mute. Okay, yes, okay. Yes, indeed, as you were referring to, so it's a very recurrent question. So what about studies carried out outside the union vis-a-vis of the notification obligations? For what concerns the obligation for the operator that have commissioned or is carrying out a study, the situation is identical to studies that are conducted in the EU or outside the EU. Because in this case, basically the operators have the obligation to notify the study, and that's it. The legal framework changes slightly for what concerns the laboratories, because if the laboratory to which the study has been commissioned is located outside the union, in this case, the co-notification obligations for the laboratory does not apply. When we say outside the union, the transparency regulation clarifies that are not subject to the notification obligations, the laboratories that are outside the union, but the obligation to notify the study will then again apply if basically the laboratory is located outside the union, but in a country that has a specific arrangement with the union. So, for example, for the moment, the 3 EEA-EFTA countries, so Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, they will be in this case. If the laboratory is located in these countries, they will be basically subject to the notification obligation. The same goes for the Northern Ireland. I hope that this was clear, and I'll give you back the floor to you, Marge.
Thank you very much, Francesca. I think we reached the end of the questions we have received, those that we wanted to highlight to you as we consider them quite frequent, and we see that there is a need for a better clarification and explanation. Even if we are like 10 minutes or even less than 10 minutes in advance, I close this webinar. I thank you very much for your attendance. And before we really close the event, I just would like to remind you, in case you are not aware, about a new LinkedIn group that we have recently launched. It was the beginning of this autumn. It is called Efsa Support to Applicants, and It is really a place, a social media channel where you can find relevant information about regulated products in general, but also the tools and the IT platforms which are used following the entry into force into application of the transparency regulation. So in this channel, you can find also alerts on training, materials, as well as the frequently asked questions that, for instance, today you had a very good example we received from the applicants, and we try to reply so for the entire community to be aware and have an answer. So you have the link there. We suggest you to follow us and be part of the LinkedIn group and interact with our colleagues. And having said this, I thank you very much for attending our webinar today. It was the last one of the year, so we will join you again next year in 2022 for a new series of webinar and the closure of some already scheduled. In case we did not manage to answer all questions, and it doesn't seem to me the case to me, but in case we haven't, please feel free to resubmit the questions via the Ask a Question EFSA Connect portal. As mentioned, the recording is available, will be available on the EFSA website together with the presentation, so you will have the opportunity to go through the slides and also the speeches that have been given by our speakers. Very final, you will receive a very short evaluation form at the end of the webinar. It will really takes you 3 minutes of your time. So we suggest you to, well, we would kindly ask you to take part of it because it's a really good way for us to have an understanding of how you found the event, if it was useful, if you would like to receive different information and a different level of details of this information. So we value very much your feedback, and we would be very happy if you can take this 3 minutes survey. And having said this, I thank you again very much for the attendance, for the engagement with us, and I'll see you next year in 2022 for new webinars. Thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.